Regional Transportation Committee to take 2019. My name is Colleen Whitlow, Chair of the DRCOG Board. Our college meetings order at 8:32, and if anyone that is here in the room or with us virtually, I would like to open up for public comment. Anybody in the room? Ellen, is there anyone online that would like to speak during the public comment? I'm not seeing any hands raised online. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to our meeting summary. I'm going to turn the mic over to Jacob for summary. So, Jacob.
Yes, thank you, Chair Whitlow. So, just want to be a little bit transparent about last month's meeting summary. We accidentally forgot to report the meeting, so I did it from memory, and I'm old and my memory is not super great. So we did our very best, but please do not hesitate if you were here last month. We didn't list you. If you see something that you remember that's not in there, please don't hesitate to point that out. Transparency in our meeting summaries is very important to us, and we want to make sure we get it right.
I'd like to also turn the mic over to Jacob to go over on our meeting next week together.
Thank you again, Chair Whitlow. I wanted to say here at the beginning rather than the end of the meeting, but it's my hope that this is the last RTC meeting at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. Chief also being here, especially on a rainy and almost snowy day. It's trying to snow down south. So we will confirm this as we get closer to June, but we believe we're going to cancel June RTC. Don't celebrate that just yet, but we'll confirm that as we get there. That will give us some time to plan for a July RTC meeting, and that's the first meeting that I hope will be at our new day and time, as we've been discussing in first Tuesday of the month. So in July, that would be July 7th at noon to 1:30 as a lunchtime meeting. We will provide lunch. Can I just get some head nods or a show of hands for those of us in the room? Does that feel like that would work? Because that was the time that was most popular. First Tuesday, again, July 7th, noon to 1:30. Does that seem to work for folks? Okay, so I will send out more information as we get closer to that date, but that's what we can probably plan for starting with our July meeting. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. And before, just for my, since I'm so new to folks, would you turn your nameplate so I can see them just a little and be easy to follow on from? Once I get a better lay of the land, I'll first name directors and commissioners titles. So thank you very much. And with that, do we have any questions or comments about last meeting minutes?
I was present.
Thank you very much. Any other? We'll assume that those minutes will be passed, and we'll move on to our first action item of the day. And the 2026-2029 Transportation Improvement Program amendments. This will be brought to us by Josh Schwank, our senior planner, programming and project delivery. Sir,
all right, thank you, Chair. I do have several amendments for it this morning. So the first is CDOT Region 4 is looking to add $11 million to pool projects to their surface treatment pool. They're also looking to add $9 million and one project to the regional priority project pool. Additionally, they're looking to shift some funding, so moving $15 million in federal raise funds from prior years into the current years on the Colorado 119 project, and add $7,711,000 in state legislative funding and $850,000 in state surface treatment funding for that project. Next, they're looking to rebalance some funding within the years of the US 287 Safety Median Project, along with adding $2,936,000 in federal infra funding, $5,483,000 in faster funding, $923,000 in state safety funding, and $2,860,000 in state legislative funding. And finally, CDOT Region 1 is looking at $8.7 million to their ramp metering equipment project. Next, we have some transfers of funding. So essentially all of this funding associated with the I-270 project is being consolidated where it had been listed in several pools. It's all being consolidated onto I-270 tip page. So that would include moving 4.6 million from the hazard elimination pool, 1 million from the bridge on system pool, 4 million from the region 1 faster pool, and 1 million from the RPP pool and 1 million from the ADA pool, and all of that funding would then be consolidated onto the I-270 corridor improvements main page. So happy to take any committee members' questions about any of those changes. I realize there are several this month. Otherwise, I do have a proposed motion available.
We will open up the floor for questions or comments from the committee. Thank you, Josh. Do we have a motion to recommend to the board of directors the attached project amendments to the 2026-2029 TIP?
I'll hold that director this month.
Is there a second? Second. Very much, Commissioner Cook. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to our informational briefings. The first one will be Metro District Economic Development Corporation, I-70 Mountain Corridor Impact Study, and this will be to us by Jacob Rieger, our Division Director.
So just a brief introduction here. Mic is on, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So good morning. Just a brief introduction on this. I don't want to steal our presenter's thunder. This is actually an update to a study that was done many years ago along the I-70 corridor, really looking at sort of the economic impacts of congestion along I-70 from multiple different perspectives. How that affects local communities, how it affects congestion, economic development, all those sorts of things. And so the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation has been working to update the assumptions in that study, and they're actually using the same methodology so that they can make some sort of longitudinal comparisons between the two studies. And it's really very fascinating. So I don't want to say more than that. I want to introduce Sean Broad, the chief economist. I'll leave it at that from Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation.
Thank you very much. Very excited to be with you all on this lovely Denver morning. I'm Sean Brugg. My actual title is very long. It's a senior economist and director of our economic competitiveness team. People think of the MDEDC as an economic development organization as part of the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, and we are. The economic competitiveness team is actually our economic research division. And so we have sort of a dual mandate where we do internal reporting for the chamber, but we also took over a company called Development Research Partners, which was managed by the great Patty Silverstein for many years. And that is where we get a lot of these third-party projects. And some of these are actually, we asked to update a project that was done many years ago that people really liked. They want to look at sort of what is going on after, in this case, 20 years of economic expansion in Colorado. So what we're trying to do with this study is really estimate what the cost of congestion is along I-70. And I want to spend a little bit of time on why this report matters. We think of I-70 or congestion along I-70 as a sort of a nuisance, but there are really economic costs to congestion. And I-70 really serves as the primary connection between Metro Denver, the Mountain Resort region, and the Western Slope. And the performance of the corridor influences a lot of things. It influences tourism, it influences workforce mobility, freight movement, public safety, and overall economic efficiency. For the 226,000 residents of the Western Slope, this provides reliable access to front range markets, which is the central core, business operations, workforce mobility, and economic stability. For the Mountain Resort region, which has 132,000 residents, congestion has a strong influence on tourism demand, but also employee access, housing affordability, and seasonal economic activity. And for the 3.3 million residents of Metro Denver, congestion affects not only leisure travel and goods movement, but this regional economic efficiency and competitiveness. So in this report, we're not proposing solutions here. It's the same as the last report that we did. We're really just trying to look at, as Colorado's economy grows, as transportation grows, we're looking at the cost of congestion and how year-round corridor performance is really critical to both regional stability and statewide competitiveness. We look at 4 metrics to get at our overall cost number here. We're looking at tourism, resident time, GDP impacts, and government impacts. And in this study, we estimate that $47 million annually in tourism revenue is at risk due to congestion along I-70. We estimate that the value of time lost for residents has increased to $319 million. The GDP impact we estimate at $1.9 billion in 2025, and the government impact, which is a function of tourism revenue, at just over $2 million in impact. This leaves our total annual cost of congestion along the I-70 corridor at $2.25 billion. I'd like to note that this is up $1.4 billion from the $839 million that we estimated in 2005. And most importantly, that this is a 53% real increase. So if we adjust for inflation, this cost is still up 53%, which means that there's a lot more going on here than just the general cost of goods and services going up over time. In addition to our headline number, we also estimated some figures that were in the original 2005 report. There was a number that came into that report which said that for every hour that I-70 is closed, $800,000 is lost. We estimate this as the amount of visitor spending per hour, the amount of resort reason that is at risk due to corridor closures. This figure has increased to $2.3 million per hour in our most recent report. We also estimate that for local mountain resort businesses, congestion along I-70 or congestion delays, I would say, raised shipping costs by about $2 million. If we look across the entire corridor, this figure rises to $14 million. We also took a look at the most recent survey of construction projects that people have looked at to be done along I-70 in the 2011 PEIS and adjusted this for the increase in construction costs over time. The upper bound figure, which is sort of the maximalist requests for capital improvements along I-70, has risen to $30 billion since the PEIS was published in 2011. We also estimate that annual maintenance costs exceed $44 million. In addition to some of these more quantifiable aspects, we looked a little bit at some qualitative themes that are emerging along the corridor. The first one that we looked at here were an increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, which can include wildfires and floods. And these can cause closures, delays, and safety risks that strain transportation infrastructure and alter travel patterns, and these are becoming more frequent. We also took a close look at housing dynamics in the mountain resort region. There's a rising prevalence of both second homes and short-term rentals in the mountain resort region that have a tendency to drive up housing costs, but most importantly, limit the ability of the mountain region workforce to live close to where they work, which puts additional pressure from commuting along the I-70 corridor. We also took a close look at traffic diversions, where closures along I-70 divert traffic onto secondary routes that are really not equipped to handle that type of volume of traffic. This results in longer travel times, but also increased safety risks and puts an increased strain on local infrastructure and communities. Really quickly, just to go over the scope and methodology of the project, the original study was done off of 2005 data, and published in 2007. Here, we're trying to maintain the same analytical framework so that we can compare the two reports over nearly 2 decades of economic growth and also population change and changing travel patterns. We try to quantify the cost of inaction along I-70, so we're not assuming that any capacity improvements are made over time here. We're looking at status quo. In this report, we've also added some of these more qualitative aspects to take account of some of the emerging things. Here we include COVID impacts, which introduce wild swings in travel behavior along the corridor. Also looking pretty closely at travel constraints, and we also have a significant focus on this climate and weather exposure and how that affects travel along the corridor. Throughout the report, we try to do this in both a quantitative and a qualitative way for some of the impacts that are less number intensive here. The impact categories we looked at are mostly the same as the report that we did in released in 2007. Looking at tourism, residential workforce characteristics, business impacts, and government impacts. We have an extended construction and infrastructure section that looks at deferring the costs of improvements over time and how that raises total costs. We also are going to include, in response to the feedback from our earlier presentations, more detailed sections on closures and break this out by region so that we can see the effects of closures at different parts of I-70, what that means both for the business community and for local infrastructure. So since the 1980s, there have been significant improvements along I-70s. Most of these are focused on safety, mobility, and environmental protection. There have been some limited capacity improvements, but despite these, overall base traffic conditions have increased so much that travel demand has really grown faster than this available capacity, and this has led to persistent and worsening congestion. From a legislative perspective, most of the policies that have gone to the state legislature have focused on safety and operational reliability along major highway corridors. There have been some significant increases in funding, most recently, most notably, Senate Bill 21260 created a dedication transportation funding in the amount of $5 billion over 10 years. I will note that even with this increase, the state of Colorado is sort of middle of the pack when it comes to state transportation dollars for highway funding. In our last Toward More Competitive Colorado report, we ranked the state 30th in the nation. Looking at base traffic conditions over time, we break this out into 3 locations that measure traffic conditions, but also that serve as placeholders for our region. So Idaho Springs is how we measure Metro Denver. The Mountain Resort is measured by the Eisenhower Tunnel, and the Western Slopes segment is measured by Glenwood Springs. Overall, Idaho Springs handles the most daily traffic. From an increase over the last 10 years perspective, Glenwood Springs has actually been growing most at over 20%. But if you look at the 20-year growth, most of these figures are right about 20%, which is an average annual growth rate of between 0.7% and 1.9%. Any of us who have driven along I-70 for the last 20 years or so knows that the lane capacity or carrying capacity by 70 doesn't expand at 1 or 2% per year, which is leading to this sort of worsening congestion over time. Traffic conditions along the corridor have a distinct seasonal component. Most vehicles actually transit the corridor in summer months. Just so you know, I'm not lying to you here. The winter period is a 6-month period here, and the summer traffic period is 4 months, which is where we get to this higher summer daily vehicle count. In terms of changes over time, the shoulder season has actually seen the largest increase since 2005 of 22.9%. Some people have theorized that this is actually a result of congestion. People are choosing to go up to the mountains or to otherwise transit the corridor in the shoulder season to avoid traffic conditions. Most of the severe congestion actually occurs in the winter. This has many factors behind it. One is relatively shortened travel season, ski weekends, and also weather conditions that really add to that congestion in the winter. Looking ahead, DRCOG estimates that total vehicle miles traveled in the region will increase by 40% by 2050. If we look at this on a location basis, that represents our segments in the report. But for the next 4 years or so, or to 2030, we anticipate a stronger increase in vehicles traveled in the Idaho Springs region. If we look out to 2035, we're looking at this mostly increasing more in the Glenwood Springs region, and also Glenwood Springs, we estimate, will have over a 35% increase by 2050. However, all these numbers are above or well above 25%, which will put additional strain and cause more severe and more frequent congestion days along the corridor. Turning to the sections that we use to estimate our numbers, I'll start first here with tourism. Tourism is a major economic driver for the state of Colorado. In 2004, we estimate that just over 95 million visitors spent about $29.5 billion in Colorado. Of this, 4.7 billion spent in the mountain resort region, which is where we get our congestion impact number. And 780 million was spent along the western slope. We're seeing some what you could call interesting patterns when it comes to lodging. Congestion along I-70 actually has ambiguous effects when it comes to lodging. People could choose to not transit the corridor and spend their leisure time a little bit closer to home, say in Metro Denver. Alternatively, they could choose to go up to the mountains at a different time period and stay overnight. This could be one of the reasons that we're seeing this dramatic increase in lodging costs and also an increase in the share of domestic overnight spending on lodging over time. I should note that there are some travel alternatives to I-70. The commercial airports up in the mountain resort region are getting progressively busier every year, so you can fly in and go skiing and avoid sitting in traffic on I-70. You can also take some other transit options, bus staying, snow staying, local transit, a private shuttle that actually takes you up to the mountains. I would like to note that currently 93% of travel along the I-70 corridor takes place in a personal vehicle. Turning to our resident impact section, the way that we estimate this is sort of interesting, and it has a lot of moving parts. What we're looking at is the number of congestion days along I-70, which has risen from 104 is when we first did the study to 131 in 2025. Additionally, more people transit the corridor, so we have more people that are caught in a congestion day, and the delays per trip have gotten a little bit longer. And also the hourly earnings of people, so what they're giving up by sitting in traffic, has increased substantially since the last report. So here, our total resident impact due to time lost due to congestion along I-70 has risen to $319 million. This is most pronounced in Metro Denver, where you can expect a 60-minute delay on a congestion day, and your average hourly earnings are just over $43 an hour. This adds up to just over $293 million in resident time lost over a year. The impact is slightly lower in the mountain resort region. The delay is a little bit lower, and the hourly earnings are a little bit lower. We estimate this at $20.2 million and $5.4 million along the western slope. In our business impact section, the main driving force here is really that economic activity, both in Front Range and across the state of Colorado, has expanded quite dramatically over the last 20 years. I believe on a real basis, GDP has increased by over 60% over that time period. What we're doing here is we are estimating the annual decline from just a small 0.5% productivity loss due to congestion-related factors across the 2 million employees that live and work along the corridor. This can happen in a number of different ways. From a labor and productivity perspective, if you have an unreliable commute, this changes the timing of when you get into work. It changes if you can get into work, if there are closures or otherwise long delays. If you sit in traffic for a long time, this increases fatigue. It can also drive employee turnover as people decide to move somewhere else and live closer to where they work. We're seeing also significant impacts in the mountain resort region where employers either have to subsidize workforce housing so that their employees can live closer to where they work, or if people are moving farther away so that they can afford to live somewhere, but then have to sit in congestion along I-70. There's also a significant freight and supply chain component to this. I gave the estimated annual costs of delays. That the shipping costs in the region is $2 million for the mountain resort region and $14 million across the corridor. Additionally, some of the mountain communities can face acute supply shortages in the event of extended closures. And this sort of limited storage capacity means that these timely deliveries of essentials are really critical for that region. One of the things we're also seeing from an economic development perspective is one of the ways that we recruit companies and therefore their workforce to the region is by selling our outdoor recreation assets to these companies. When you have less reliable or more or time-consuming access to these amenities, it can start to affect our ability to attract and retain primary employers and jobs. On the government impact section, sticking with the earlier report, we estimate this as a loss of sales tax revenue. I do want to highlight that this probably masks some of the major costs that are going on in terms of government impacts. One of the main things that we're seeing is an increase in accidents that have to be met with a local response from government entities. Congestion, according to the academic research, raises sort of these peak congestion hour crashes by over 30%. And this is putting a significant strain on governmental budgets that's not actually captured in this figure, but we're going to capture in the closure section that we are adding to the report. We also added a beyond the numbers section to this version of the report that really tries to get at some of the most recent emerging themes along the corridor. We look here first at what we're calling a housing crisis. Really what this is a significant housing increase, 200 to 300% resort rates since the year 2000. There's also a rising prevalence, as I mentioned, of second homes and short-term rentals, which is pushing workers out further distances, forcing longer commutes, and worsening congestion in somewhat of a feedback loop. On the climate and weather side, as I mentioned, we are seeing more frequent closures from extreme weather events. There's another pattern here, which is decreasing snow days, which actually can cause increased congestion as people sort of rush to the mountains when you actually do get snow, which is causing some interesting travel patterns. This is sort of increasing the demand unpredictability of the corridor. From a diversion risk perspective, closures are pushing more traffic, as I mentioned earlier, onto routes that are really not designed to handle this kind type and volume of traffic. And communities face these sort of sudden surges of traffic that increase safety risks and put a significant strain on infrastructure. We also have added a health and environment section where we're looking at how congestion raises pollutant exposure, emissions, and travel stress, and also CO2 in particular matter that worsens in stop and go conditions, how that might affect people over time. I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the 2007 report to the 2026 report. I want to look first at the overall headline numbers. So these are not adjusted for inflation. What we found here is an overall 168% growth in total impact. Of this, there was an 88% increase in tourism impact. This is actually the smallest figure of any. The real driving force behind the major increase in this version is in resident time loss. As I mentioned earlier, there are more people transiting the corridor, hitting more congestion delays that are taking more time, and they are sacrificing more in hourly earnings, which is really raising this up. The business increase also rose quite substantially. Again, this is a function of a dramatic increase in economic activity in the region. If we adjust these figures for inflation, though, we get a little bit of a different pattern. So a 53% increase in the overall impact when inflation adjusted. Only 7% of this increase is in tourism impact. So what this means is that tourism spending in the mountain resort region and along the corridor hasn't risen by much more than inflation. We could theorize that this might be somewhat due to congestion-related effects. The resident time loss component, that's up 114% in real terms. So this is the main driving force behind the inflation-adjusted increase. The business increase, again, mirrors sort of this GDP increase on a real basis, up 7% from the 2007 study, and is the second highest driver of the increased impact. So overall, I think our main takeaways from this study is that I-70 congestion is not really only a transportation inconvenience. It really functions as an economic constraint that has measurable consequences for every sector of Colorado's economy. Congestion costs here have grown in real terms, not just due to inflation. This increase reflects partly population growth, higher wages, and expanded tourism volumes. The other thing that we really want to note here is that the cost of delayed construction really compounds over time. This upper bound estimate of $30 billion is a lot of money. If you continue to delay the things you want to do along I-70, is going to cost you much more in the future. We'll also note that the way that we did these impacts is we're assuming sort of this Federal Reserve long run rate of inflation of 2%. I think from the most recent numbers that everybody has seen, that might not be what we're looking at for the next couple of years. We also think that congestion is really embedded in a broader system of structural challenges that include this housing, workforce, climate, and diversion pressure component that we need to pay close attention to over time. And overall, we think that reliable year-round corridor performance is increasingly central to Colorado's regional stability and statewide competitiveness. I have some alternative text in the presentation that's also in your packet for any of the slides that has graphs on them. And I would like to take any questions that you have at this time.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very well done and lots of information to digest. So thank you. Questions or comments for Sean?
Madam Chair, two questions. I'm just kind of trying to understand your methodology. This study was in concert with a number of economic development entities along various municipalities along the I-70 corridor?
Sure. So this was originally brought to us, the idea to update the study from CDOT. And we also gathered a group of stakeholders that helped us sort of kick the project off and had regular meetings, some of which included those communities that you're mentioning. The main thing that we were trying to do here is identify, we wanted to preserve the methodology of the original study so that we could give comparable 20-year difference figures. However, when we were looking at what else we wanted to include in the study, this is where we really relied on the communities to tell us, hey, what is going on in I-70 or along I-70 over the last 20 years that you really wanted to focus on. This is where we really got into the extreme weather events that are causing closures, diversions that are pushing traffic onto these roads that are not designed to handle it. Those are the two main things that came out of those communities. The other is the significant strain on resources for the local cities and counties that are along the corridor that have to deal with an increased frequency of responding to emergency events. And then the final thing is really looking at this closure component by the different segments, because there's a big difference between if I-70 closes closer to Idaho Springs or if it closes to the tunnel. So I'd say that I don't think we got necessarily all of the communities along I-70 to get on board and give us feedback on where to go with this report, but we did get a lot of them, and that really drove the sections of the report that we had more of an ability to change with this version versus the last version.
Okay, gotcha. And then, so I understand, obviously, a desire to kind of keep it a apples to apples comparison. But a random thought occurred to me as well that you do have movement going eastbound rather, coming from. I was wondering if that was also part of your analysis, or is it mostly westbound?
So I actually didn't include this in the presentation, but we do have a significant trucking and freight section that does look at this, and it looks at both directions along I-70. Also, despite the way that I might have phrased this, we are looking at bi-directional traffic when it comes to congestion delays. So when I say that the average delay is 60 minutes from Metro Denver, it's not just going up to the mountains, that's also getting back.
Okay.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you. You pointed out middle of the road maintenance or highway funding. Is that in the report? I didn't see it first time through.
Yes, sorry. So every year, my group does a report called Toward a More Competitive Colorado, and we rank the state versus every other state in the nation This year we did 38 indicators, 4 of which are in this transportation and infrastructure section. I can get everyone a copy of the report. We put it out, typically try to get it out before the legislative session starts. So our most recent report came out in January, which you can take a look at there. That's where that number is included in our most recent publication.
I'd love to get it. One thing to note is that if we're middle of the road on funding, the maintenance challenges are not middle of the road for Colorado. I mean,
Exactly.
the elevation, the climate, the severe events that we have sometimes out there, but also some of those factors affect our maintenance costs. So we supplement employee maintainers salaries by a couple thousand a month when they live in that corridor in order for them to be able to work nearby. And we also have built or co-developed affordable housing in several communities to try to limit that commute. But all of that leads to higher costs. Every year we have to backfill in order to make the maintenance funds whole for that reason. So I just was quite struck by that. Another thing I'd let you know is the Winter Park, the mountain rail.
Yeah.
Will go online later this year or next year. One finding of the Winter Park Express was that we had a surprising amount of commuter traffic out of Frazier.
Okay.
And like a 22% increase, and that doesn't hit too much of the I-70 corridor, but up to US 40. And once there's a 24/7, not 24/7, but every day of the week, and then every all year, I think we'll see that compounded. So hopefully that will provide some minor relief on the I-72 and corridor.
And I don't know if anybody noticed it, but we actually had that. I had that in the slide. I just brushed over it really quickly. Some of the other alternatives to I-70 that are coming online. On the maintenance perspective, I think one of the things we picked up on when we did our Toward More Competitive Colorado report is just what you mentioned, that because of the weather patterns and the other factors that you just said, Colorado really needs to be in the top 10 or 15 to actually have that sort of equal weighting when it comes to our needs versus our spending.
Thank you.
Dr. Spear and then Director Davis.
Thank you. My question is around climate change and how that is going to interact with congestion patterns over the next 20 years. So if we're having, for example, long winters like the last one, how are you projecting that patterns will change over those years?
Sure. Projecting what's going to go on with climate is not actually my field, but I did write a separate report which was looking at the property and casualty insurance industry in the state of Colorado. And to do that, I looked at these sort of extreme weather events. From in the 1980s, 1990s, we could expect maybe 5 extreme weather events. This could be severe hail, wildfire, drought. This number has increased substantially. There were 30 extreme weather events that caused over $1 billion in damage in the 2010s, and already in the first 6 years this decade, I believe we've had 22 in the state. So any way you look at it, these events are becoming more frequent and they're becoming more severe. I don't see any change in this pattern over time. I think the frequency will increase. I think the severity will increase, and I think that will cause continued or an increase in closures and the time of closures along I-70 over time. The other thing that you mentioned, something like a low snowpack here. When I originally looked at this data, I said, "Oh, low snowpack here, few pounds, and that will reduce congestion along I-70." It turns out it actually doesn't work that way. Everybody tries to jam in the days that they go up to the mountains on snow days, and it actually makes those congestion days much more severe. So that is the pattern that I expect to see going forward. And I really don't see anything on that front that's going to change. I think what you really have to focus on is how you handle closures, the other sort of mitigation efforts that you can make, because I think that this pattern is sort of set for the time being.
Director Davis and Director Clark.
Thank you. Thank you for the thank you for the presentation. So I just had a couple of questions because I thought it was very interesting. We have a state demographer that says that people are moving
out of the state, yet we're seeing this increase in traffic along the I-70 corridor, which I thought was very, very interesting. And you explained it beautifully. There's more people that are commuting from longer distances because of housing costs. And I just wanted to ask about the rental vehicles. Are we getting any data from rental companies on rentals that are going up to the from Den or from Steamboat or other airports?
Sure, it's a really interesting question. If I take first the population component, I don't want to jump in front of Dr. Kate Watkins because she's really good at the demography office. But the population decrease that they're mentioning is coming from a decrease in net migration and a forecasted decrease in international migration that is expected that is hitting in 2025. It's expected to hit in 2026. However, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. If we look over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, Colorado's population growth has grown by almost a full percentage point above the United States. So that's a relatively recent phenomenon that I think might affect our future projections, but it hasn't really affected the most recent 20 years or so in terms of population growth and vehicle demand on the corridor. On the rental, I did get asked something close to the rental question, which was when we're talking about personal vehicles, do we mean rentals and someone's actual personal car? We do actually mean both here. But the way that we're looking at it is vehicles along the corridor, not as where those come from. But that's a really interesting thing that we might. I should note that we're still in the process of doing revisions to this report. I can check with Den because I know that they do produce rental car data. I just don't know if they produce data on where those go. That's publicly available. That would be an interesting thing to look at. There's been a substantial increase in people flying into Den. There's obviously a substantial increase in people who are transiting through Den. Are those people, or more of those people renting cars and going up to mountains? It's an interesting question that I think I'll look into for the revisions, see if we can get hard data on that. Yeah.
But I appreciate that. And then just one more observation about housing.
Yeah.
So we say there are more short-term rentals. It would be interesting data to see, are those short-term rentals recent purchases within the past 10 years? And then they were turned into short-term rentals, or are they family homes that people have aged out, but the family wants to keep it for their generational wealth, and they're renting them out, versus a condo, which unfortunately we're not building enough condos to have those starter homes in the mountains. I think that's just important for us to consider. When we talk about housing in the mountains, it has exploded. It's exploded everywhere. I just came back from Hawaii, and I thought it was very interesting on the island of Maui how they're dealing with. They call them temporary vacation dwellings or something like that, and they were talking about how they're going to release 6,000 of these TDAs or TDTs into the community. The folks that are selling them are not they're gonna sell them at the market. And so does that alleviate our housing crisis when things are being sold at market for folks who are having difficulty meeting the current rental market? But I just wanted to keep that in the forefront of our minds. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mark and yourselves. Thank you. I also want to thank you for this presentation. It's really well done, and I'm happy to be introduced to the work of and what your group is. I know that we had that capacity, and that's great. I work in affordable housing, so I do want to ask. It's a question if you have feedback. Otherwise, it's a comment. Curious about, we know that housing is a crisis across our state, and is that much more constrained in our mountain communities because of just physical constraints, higher land costs, all of the second homes, and just there's not nearly enough supply. And also just the costs of producing housing are higher. So I'm curious about the relationship between those high costs and things that we're trying to do to bring those costs down, including modular housing and things like that to reduce labor and construction costs. And it feels like it should work the best in the mountains, but having numbers like these with respect to congestion and other things could certainly constrain that further. And we're often not getting the benefit of the cost savings that we think we'd have, because it's one of those things that we're trying to shift that is probably hitting some pinch points. So just curious if that is a factor in any of this, if that's been considered, trying to figure out where there's data to help understand that impact.
We do have a section in the report that discusses some of the efforts that have been made by both local governments and employers with regard to housing. Most of this, from my perspective, is setting up some dedicated funding to create, to subsidize the building of deed restricted percentage of area median income, or on the employer side, setting up dedicated workforce housing. That's all in the report. I think one of the things that I would like to note there is, because local governments and businesses are spending money doing this, and this is becoming more prevalent, I think my hunch is that they're going to start to look at some of these other options that you mentioned, like modular housing, like other things, to reduce the overall costs of building, to reduce the overall amount that they have to spend to subsidize workforce housing in the region. That's something that I've seen some presentations of this stuff. It seems like it's in its early stages, but it looks really promising. So I think maybe it'd be better to reach out to these communities and see if they're doing anything on that front as we do the revisions here and add that to that section. So yeah, great comment.
Director Silverstein and Commissioner Benford, and then we'll close for comments.
So thank you, and thank you for the great presentation. One comment on the alternatives. You did mention Highway 285 as an alternative, and just curious if that's factored into the work.
Sure. So what we're talking mostly about there is, I guess you could say, alternatives to driving your own vehicle along I-70, but we also include this airport section, and I think that like some of the alternative routes to get to the same place, resort community, are covered a little bit more in this closure section, but it might be beneficial to also include that in sort of this, what you're saying, it's like an alternative that people are taking to get up there that exists, not necessarily because they're being forced to do it, but just because they want to take it to avoid I-70.
That's the trend I see. Okay, and one thing that I think is, on closures and congestion that's really front in my mind is enforcement. It's accidents due to speeding, aggressive driving, poorly maintained vehicles, whatever that category could include. But it seems that so much of the congestion, at least observationally, is due to accidents where you have either a lane closed or the whole highway closed for periods of time that really, if you put a dollar figure to that, is quite significant. So how is accidents part of this analysis, or could it be included in a future analysis?
Sure. I think the main way that we're looking at accidents is in this strain on the local governments in terms of emergency response along their sections of the I-70 corridor. The other thing we're looking at is, just because more people transit the I-70 corridor doesn't mean that you're stopping in some of these cities and counties and spending more money, which would result in increased sales tax revenue that they could put towards spending more money on emergency services. We've had some conversations with communities that are telling us that they're sort of to the max 100% on emergency services, and this is mostly going, again, it's mostly going into this closure and diversion section of the report. I think on the enforcement side, that's something I haven't really thought about as being a contributing factor. I think it gets maybe a little bit, it gets a little bit into like a suggestion of what you might do for trying to not pose in this report. But I think that as a contributing factor to accidents, it could be important to draw the link between stretched emergency services and reduced ability to have to do robust enforcement. So that's something that I'll take with me to the revisions.
Schumacher.
Thank you. You provided great detail as to what the problem is. I'm just wondering if CDOT then going to take this information and provide some of the solutions. And I know with the state extract funds to 175 coming up, presenting additional problems for CDOT. So, what's the next step?
So I think that the goal of this report is to put a lot of robust data out there so that other entities, not ourselves, can use this every time they try to get something done related to I-70. They can sort of roll out some data and some analysis to back up what they're trying to do. I believe that that's what happened with the prior report. Some of the figures in there became, widely quoted figures that were brought up every time there was a need to increase transportation funds, to do major capital improvements, that kind of thing. So what I would say is that I hope that this report is used in that way. I think that that's the goal from my perspective. Unfortunately, I don't think that we are going to be out front proposing the solutions. That we will be available to back you up with data and presentations should you need it.
Thank you very much, sir, for your presentation, and thank you for the great discussion. For being here with us today.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on. Next in our informational briefing, built to move multimodal supportive local development standards update by our senior planner, Cole Leader.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Cole Meter. I'm DRCOG Senior Transit Planner, and today, together with our consultant providing technical assistance on this project, Andrew Rutz, we'd like to provide an update on a project that we're currently working on, DRCOG Multimodal Local Development Standards Toolkits, otherwise known as Build to Move. So a little bit of background on the project before we get started. Communities that DRCOG often works with across our region are always working to create more safe and connected places. And that means that our transportation and land use decisions must be coordinated. And when those decisions are made together, people have better access to transit, bicycle infrastructure, and pedestrian infrastructure within their own respective communities. To provide a roadmap for better coordination efforts between land use and transportation topics, DRCOG staff is putting together the Build to Move multimodal toolkit to provide regional development design guidance that is context sensitive and also applicable to the urban, suburban, and rural environment that we see across our region. So this is a good visual of how this toolkit fits into other work that DRCOG does, specifically the Regional Complete Streets Toolkit. So at a high level, this toolkit builds on and aligns with work that is completed as part of that toolkit. So while the Complete Streets work focuses on improvements made along the public right-of-way, the Build to Move toolkit provides more guidance on the private side for commercial and mixed-use development that contributes to that multimodal environment. And for a bit of project progress, there we go. We've completed the following activities to date. We've reviewed our member government's transportation and comprehensive and land use plans, and we've also reviewed and conducted comprehensive analysis on zoning codes, development ordinances, and other related local policies that identify different best practices, also the patterns to local development approach across our region. Like I said, this is also a context-sensitive document, so we've also established different development typologies that we're going to go over in a little bit that are relevant to the unique community context within this region. So using the data that we've also collected, we're putting together different case studies of successful multimodal development examples across the region to learn from our peers about what is working and also what is not. And finally, throughout this process, we've hosted multiple iterations of our focus groups with member government staff to ensure that we're putting together something that's not just going to sit on our plan shelf, but is actually also useful. So for today, we want to provide an update of what we've come up with for our development typologies. We also want to present a preliminary toolkit outline, get your guys' feedback on that, and then also some important takeaways that we've gathered from our focus group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to go in a little bit more detail about those, and then we will get your guys' feedback and questions at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Cole. Good morning, everyone. As Cole said, I'm Andy Rutz. I'm an urban designer with Crescendo Planning and Design. We're a part of the team that's being led by DRCOG, being led by Farron Pierce, supporting DRCOG in the effort. So as Cole said, one of the things that we have been working on the last several months is trying to kind of define the spectrum of development types that this toolkit will be particularly applicable to. So as Cole said, we know that the region has made a lot of investments in multimodal infrastructure, and a lot of that happens in the public realm, in the right of way. And so the intent with this toolkit is how do we encourage the private development side to interact really robustly with those multimodal facility investments so that folks are really taking advantage of them. And we're trying to focus specifically on commercial and mixed use environments as a really good opportunity to kind of catalyze the use of those facilities. So what you see in this sort of spectrum of development types, and again, we're trying to define these across the whole region. So we've got member jurisdictions of all shapes and sizes, trying to make these as digestible and intuitive as possible. So on one end of the spectrum, we've got the ones that folks are most familiar with, downtown core developments, where we're going to see a lot of kind of medium, large scale infill, maybe adaptive reuse possibilities. Moving along this spectrum, corridor developments, so similar in their composition of land use, but along more linear built environment forms. The neighborhood mixed use, which would be smaller infill, maybe smaller adaptive reuse opportunities that are typically surrounded by lower density residential neighborhoods. Retrofit developments, they tend to be the more concentrated commercial uses. Think of former shopping mall sites, maybe shopping centers along corridors where we're trying to retrofit those to be more mixed use, maybe infused with residential opportunities. And then master plan developments, which are kind of the more one-off, ground-up mixed-use environments. So you can see we've got examples of some of these that occur within our member jurisdictions. The last of those, Lone Tree being a good example of their Ridgegate development, sort of building around transit and starting from the ground up, trying to be mixed use. As Cole mentioned, we've had a lot of input with focus groups so far from all of our member jurisdictions, and we really started the conversation kind of from a listening session standpoint of asking those jurisdictions, what are some of the challenges you have when you've got private development interests to get them to engage in a meaningful way with the multimodal investments that you're making. The second of these focus groups, we talked a little bit about specific projects, and we started to introduce this idea of the development types. We started to go over the potential outline of the toolkit, really trying to make sure that, as Cole mentioned, we're calibrating this to be really end user friendly and not just a high level policy document. And then what we'll do in the third meeting is really go through the draft of the toolkit with those member jurisdictions, trying to point out how we think it can help them move the needle. We've had a lot of really good conversations, and these next two slides are just a summary of some of the big takeaways that we've heard repeatedly in those conversations. So the first focuses on what are some of the challenges that our member jurisdictions are having, trying to deliver these multimodal supportive environments. And one of the ones we hear a lot is the challenges of just collaborating jurisdictionally. So if there is a long or a large scale corridor investment, how do you ensure that your neighbors are also sort of working in concert to try to create that same built environment outcome? We've heard a lot about the challenges of just attracting developers, especially in certain context to want to deliver mixed use products. We've heard a lot about the challenges of communities that have a fairly suburban grid or fairly suburban development pattern now that have aspirations to transition to maybe a more urban or mixed use environment, and just the challenges that go along with the infrastructure side delivering that. And then we hear quite a bit about the challenge of taking these visionary documents or high level plans and really getting the through line to development review and approvals and permitting. We have also talked at length with our groups about what do they want this toolkit to be? How can we make sure that it's most useful for staffs in our member jurisdictions? And in some cases, there's just an appetite for, hey, we need a starting point that's sort of a common language across the region, so that when we're talking to developers, they're hearing the same message sort of all the way across Denver Metro. There's in some communities an appetite for just, we need a policy starting point, we need a foundation. We've got big ideas about what we'd like our regulations to deliver, but we don't have a strong policy footing to enable our elected or appointed to act on those things. In some cases, we've heard, we can always use more reference guidelines and sort of best practice information. And then, as I had mentioned before, helping to use this document to bridge some of those cross-jurisdictional divides, and then that gap between visionary and long-range planning and development review is something that a lot of us have really expressed an appetite for. So in terms of how we're trying to organize the toolkit itself, Cole had mentioned this idea of community contexts, and as you all know, the member jurisdictions within DRCOG have a pretty wide range of scales and densities, and so trying to keep that relatively simple at an urban, suburban, rural, and mountain context. The idea is that users of the document hopefully can sort of plug in anywhere in the sort of hierarchy, so to speak. So we wanted to acknowledge that community context is something that folks would self-identify. And that's largely because some of our communities are sort of moving context as they grow or as development conditions change. Then in order to really plug this into our Complete Streets toolkit that DRCOG has, we've got a layer that acknowledges here are the street types that exist within these mixed-use environments. The thinking being, if your staffs are working along a particular corridor or a particular street type, they can sort of jump to that level in the document to then see the development types that are most sort of appropriate or most compatible with the street types. And then within each, we have it listed here as design standards. I would say it's probably more design guidelines or design guidance. And that's one piece of feedback we've heard from a lot of our focus groups is, we'd really like a range that we should nest within, but at the end of the day, we need to make decisions that fit our jurisdictions the best, but help us find the bumpers and the guidelines to nest within. And then underneath that, we'll have a set of implementation tools. And as you see there, there will be a variety of levels to that. Something as high level as here's policy guidance that can help set the foundation, all the way down to here are specific regulatory tools that you could contemplate baking into your code. And then finally, in terms of next steps, and we had presented to the TAC yesterday, one of the things we've had a really explicit ask from our member jurisdictions on is just a set of case studies of who's doing this really well. How did these projects that succeeded in this deliver it? Was it a policy charge? Was it a combination of policy and private sector partnerships? And so I had asked of that group, and I would say the same here. If you know of projects that are working really well in your community or across the country, we will gladly take suggestions of things that we can do the legwork on researching and bake into the toolkit. The thinking is that if this is sort of a one-stop shop for folks where they can, find kind of some seeds of wisdom that they can go research on their own, it'll be even more valuable. And then the other piece that we're doing right now is developing some of those development strategies and guidelines to put into the draft of the toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Cole. I'll open up the floor for questions or comments.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I'm a planner myself, so that's excited about these things. I'm curious about the role of trunk infrastructure with all of this. That I've had the experience of working with City of Denver, which has really good, I think, complete streets kind of guidance and thoughts. But when we go to develop it, there's not been the level of coordination between. I understand what we're saying here between the long range plan and the private development community, and I represent that as well. But often, or not, but and we often get into a space where if public works is not a part of it as well, that the beautiful plans we have for the multimodal vision we have for the width of a street and where these different crossings are going to be and things like that get whittled down because of where the storm sewer line is, or easements for those things, and water lines and what have you. And so I'm just curious, is that part of kind of the development strategies, or how does that, because it often feels like that is a major impediment to implement what we actually want to do at the service.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good example of how the focus groups that we posted have evolved too. When we did the first iteration, it was a lot of, I mean, and it's mostly because of our network as well as a lot of transportation planners. And that's then kind of evolved into now we have more engineers involved, people directly involved in the permitting process as well. So getting their feedback, I think, is going to be directly reflected in terms of what we actually put together. So yeah.
That's good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking at what you're saying about bridging gaps, and then like bridging gaps across jurisdictions is hard, and often bridging gaps across departments within a city is almost as hard. So yeah, thanks. Director Kondo and then Director Spear.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Cole, for the presentation. I know that while you were speaking, I just kind of had a couple of brainstorms, and some of it is as a result of our recent Puget Sound Regional Council peer trip. So I'm just going to relay a few things for we did do a tour of Redmond, Washington, which was very interesting. You're shaking your head.
Yeah, that just
Okay, gotcha. Well, you know, this was a community that was largely rural farming and all that other stuff in 20 years. And I think it's quite interesting. And my comment to tie it all into this is, it's like, do we need to figure out, as part of this toolkit, a plan of action to bring in the business community? Now, obviously, Redmond is the headquarters of Microsoft. Starbucks and Amazon there. But it seems to me that I'm going to call it a housing authority, but I think it's a cooperative, Plymouth Housing, which is a nonprofit. Thank you, Jackie. I think played a key role in kind of bringing the chambers of commerce, these large corporations, to bear, because obviously it's in their best interest to have affordable housing for their workforce. And since, and my takeaway, and perhaps maybe other members who were on this trip with me can make sure that, speaking factually, it seems like getting these large businesses on board is critical, because they're going to help with providing perhaps funding or other sort of motive force to get everybody to come together to make affordable housing for their workforce come to fruition. So I just offer that up. Obviously, this is fresh in my mind, but that was my.
Yeah, definitely, and that's good feedback for what we're doing here. I think that the closest we get for this specific project at the moment would be putting together towards the conclusion of this project, we're going to put together a developer panel, so we get to hear from the private side perspective, and that they get to have a space to talk directly to municipal staff and have those conversations without an actual proposal hanging over them at the time too. That's the closest we get to the private sector at this moment, but we're also trying to, large part of this project, the conclusion of it is how to make this toolkit effective and how to actually shop it around and implement it. And so we can take that into consideration as we're doing that as well.
You had a comment.
So.
Yeah, the only comment I was gonna make on the previous ask was, I will say on our team side, we've been surprised through the process of how many like process oriented asks we've gotten. I think coming into this, the presumption was, hey, this is gonna be really focused on like dimensional guidance, and regulatory tools that help activate, especially like the ground floor buildings. And as Cole was saying, as it's evolved, we've even had some member jurisdictions like very transparently and generously say, like, here's the process we're mapping out internally to start to connect the dots between the long range vision and then the folks who are at the development review and permit counter. And so often those conversations get missed. And so we are planning on putting a piece of that into this toolkit for jurisdictions that may have not connected that dot yet, as a here's some peers and here's some process tools that you can kind of look to make that happen.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I have one question and then one comment. My question is whether you're putting architects as you're talking about the developers and things, at least in Boulder, it seems like the architects are often the ones who are driving more of the multimodal compatible development.
So we've decided as the approach to the focus groups specifically that we've already put together, that would be on the public side, that would be their direct input. But for the developer panel specifically, that's what we're exploring, contacting that part of the process as well.
Oh, thank you. And then my comment was, at Boulder, we've had a couple of projects lately that I think exemplify this of working with the developer from the beginning. One is the development near the Foothills Hospital that was really good about tapping into existing multi-use paths and things like that. The other is the development that is emerging on baseline. You may have heard about it as Council Killed the Dead Horse. That's another one where it was very helpful in the early conversations, and it just makes me think about the other people that might find utility in this as folks on planning boards, transportation advisory boards, even elected officials, local elected officials as well, because it was our conversations during site review that really drove a lot of the changes that the developer made to tap into those networks.
All right, very much. Any other questions or comments for Andrew? All right, thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us today, and let's go. We'll move on to regional multimodal freight plan update. Michael.
We'll get so transitioning into a similar topic. We're at the project midpoint for our regional multimodal freight plan update. We want to give you guys an update on the work that we've done so far with that plan and get your feedback on that work completed as well. As you guys recall, our first multimodal freight plan, the first iteration of that plan was completed between 2020 and 2021. This is now a recurring update. We wanted to expand the plan a little bit. So we do have for you guys today, we have our existing conditions reports, and then portions of our land use and policy report. And then we're going to go over next steps and when we anticipate the plan to be completed as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to our consultant providing assistance on this project as well.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. We will be talking today, as Paul said, give you an update on what we've completed on this project and then what we'll be doing for upcoming work. So our project scope overall for this is we're updating the freight plan that was done in 2020. So we are looking at existing conditions and seeing how those are different from the last plan. We did a literature review. We updated a lot of the data and looked at the area regionally to really understand how freight is moving around the DRCOG region, and that's a lot of what's included in that existing conditions report that you have Also for this, we are looking at land use and policy and how land use really interacts with freight. It's a really important connection, especially when we look at major freight generators, understanding where are the freight intensive areas that we have and how is our trucks and rail getting to all of those different areas. So we did do a review of some of the local land use regulations to better understand what those look like. Freight was included in all of those, some of them a little bit more than others, but good to go through that so that we can come up with some different guidelines and things that could assist land use agencies and transportation agencies working together to support freight. Our third component is best practices. No need to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to look around and find different ways that other regions are dealing with similar issues that we've seen. Last mile delivery is one that is very important to the area and one that we have found some good examples of. And then finally, the priorities and performance measures. How do we measure that we've actually improved freight along the region as we're going through these different plans, and kind of what is a framework to look at that? So looking at our project overview, kind of went over most of this, but we wanted to visualize the data a little bit more this time around. That's why you'll see a lot of maps in that existing conditions report. It's really good to be able to see all of that and visualize it. We'll highlight those best practices. Also wanted to note that we did a lot of stakeholder input for this plan. We had still have an excellent freight steering committee that is as a number of folks from the private sector, the public sector. We have the airport, BNSF, just a number of groups to really help us ground truth what we're doing. We can do all the analysis that we want to, but if it doesn't actually make sense on the day-to-day level, it doesn't really matter. So they have been really good about working with us to look at those, review those, help us really understand where the issues are, validate what we're seeing from the data, and then also serving as champions for the plan. We want to make sure that it's a plan that's usable and that people go back and reference. So they've been really great with that. We also did a stakeholder survey and got about 30 responses from that. So that was really helpful to help us find some additional locations where there might be issues. And actually everything from that survey really fell into line with what we were hearing from the FSC and also what the data was showing us. This is just an example of some of the feedback that we received. This is specifically from the FSC, but I think general overall trends that we are seeing is concerns with truck parking related, one, to safety, where trucks are parked sometimes in undesignated areas, which can cause safety issues for not just them, but also the traveling public. In addition, for trucks, having them in neighborhoods or in downtown areas where there are also bicycles and pedestrians and transit routes, just trying to accommodate all those areas and figuring out how do we balance that and make things as safe as we can. Another thing was just bottlenecks, getting freight through. That great presentation this morning talked about the economic impacts of when 70 is closed. Freight very much feels that, and so no surprise, I-70 and I-25 were the main, some of the main roadways that we heard a lot about. We also had a lot of great ideas, wanting to look at freight micro hubs, looking at ways to try and have less idling for trucks, less waiting. There's an issue with staging as well. Trucks come in and maybe have an appointment to be able to drop off their goods, and sometimes they get there early, and so they need a place to wait. So how do we address all of those things? Project overview. We started this in June of 2025. We are moving along well on the existing conditions of land use. Just gave DRCOG the best practices. We're talking about performance measures today after this meeting. So we will have a draft plan by July 2026, and then are planning to have the final plan adopted by October. So a little bit more information on existing conditions. We just really wanted to find out how is the system running? How do we understand that? So we looked at a number of different things, including rail crossings, the highway freight network, intermodal terminals, where freight is going, how it's transferring from rail onto trucks. Trucks are the most dominant form of freight in the area, moving through the state and also stopping within the state as well. But really looking at that system performance and updating that data. And of course, safety is one of our main focuses on this. And so this is just an example of a couple of the maps that are in there that really get to the areas where crashes are more prevalent, and just understanding what that data looks like and where we need to be focusing on safety on some of these freight corridors. On land use and policy, we spent a lot of time updating the tier 3 map. So there's 3 different tiers of roadways. The first one is what you would expect freight going through interstates, major, like faster roadways that they're trying to get through. But then the tier 3 is also important because it's more of the local roads. So that aren't necessarily designed for freight. And so we took a look with the FSC to understand where they're really seeing freight at, looking at that data and trying to get a better idea of where we need to plan for freight, especially as there's a lot more developments going in, a lot more warehousing, and trying to figure out how we're going to safely get freight to these areas. We also did a cluster analysis, and this is a map that shows an example of that. It's explained more in the existing conditions, but these are really helpful to understand where the majority of freight intensive land uses are, and looking at zoning and how that impacts that. So basically just trying to know where the trucks and freight are coming to and going out of, and where we need to be getting them to, and making sure that we are serving those areas and providing trucks what they need to get to and from. We did find that this was pretty much in line with what we saw in the 2020 plan, so not a whole lot of new things there. The best practices and emerging trends, curbside management is something that has come up and again is an issue in other cities as well. So we provided some recommendations on ways to work with that. There's options to do different types of looking at, like, having cameras look at the streets to figure out that when trucks are parked somewhere where maybe they're not, or vice versa. And then there's also reservation systems that can potentially be an option, so that trucks that are doing deliveries, say in the downtown area, would be able to make a reservation and know that they have a parking space there, just to keep that flow better. We also looked at micro hubs, where there would be a number of different things going on there for deliveries. So maybe all the deliveries happen in one place, kind of like Amazon does with they have the little areas where they can drop off a whole bunch of packages, and then they don't have to go all around and drop them off to a number of different areas. And then we also had some not recommendations, but some ideas on emissions reduction and delivery, how we make that faster again, so trucks aren't just sitting and idling and waiting. So moving on to performance measures, we're going to take a look at these based on what the federal performance measures are. There's a lot of those. They apply a little more though to the state level. So we'll be working, and we have been working a lot with CDOT throughout the entire plan, but taking those federal performance measures and figuring out how we can move that down to a more regional level to make those effective, and really be able to understand the connection between the freight improvements and the investment that goes into those, and how funding should be spent, and be able to track that as far as performance goes. So our next steps are to finalize the land use and policy section, looking at the best practices, and then we'll be reviewing our engagement section again. We still have another meeting with the FSC and a few other things that we're doing on that, so keeping that updated. And I think that's it. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Christina Cole. I'll open up the floor. Questions, Director Condo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, is it Christina?
Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. Really appreciate that. I'm really intrigued by the micro hub concept. In fact, I think I saw that in action at a CML Colorado Municipal League meeting at Breckenridge. So what this was, as you were describing it, was a transshipment point where large trucks would come, offload their goods, and then kind of unpack the crates, if you will, and make smaller packages so electric vehicles can complete the movement of supplies in the Breckenridge, a resort town, limited streets, limited parking. And so I was wondering if that might be a study for you all to look at. I think they also did it in Aspen as well.
Yeah, that is absolutely something that we can include. And yeah, the micro hubs, that's a great example. It just kind of depends on what the needs are in the area. They can take on a lot of different things. Sometimes there's staging for them. It just kind of depends, but that's right on exactly what it is. And we'll take a look at that and see if we can get that included in there as well as an example.
Yeah, and not only is it the inflow of logistics, but I think it's also the backflow of recyclables, raw waste, the empty beer, eggs, and all this other stuff. So it seems like it's at least to me, just found that whole tour, it was really insightful about how to be more efficient getting out to that last mile. Thank you.
Dr. Spear.
Thanks so much. This is really cool. I'm glad to see all that you're working on. Thank you. My question may be a little bit too sci-fi for Tuesday morning, but I'm just wondering how drug delivery fits into some of this thinking, if that's anything that's working.
Yeah, that would fall in our best practices and emerging technology section. So the approach that we're generally using for that section is taking examples of that, whether they're across the state or across the country, and then just contextualizing them within the Denver region to see if that's operational. So there's no regulatory component for that or anything like that, but that's something where a local municipality, for example, was exploring ordinance or policy related to that, they could reference this very plan and get some starting guidance on it.
Any other questions or comments? Oh, Dr. Wizard.
Thank you. Last time we talked about this, I brought this up, so I'm wondering now, who are you considering freight? What are those companies and what are you looking at specifically? The largest freight carrier in the state of Colorado is the United States Postal Service, probably closely followed by Walmart or Amazon at this point, probably still Walmart where they're doing this type of freight delivery around metro area in particular. So I'm just curious beyond, I don't know, I see Werner and some other companies. I'm not trying to do a plug for anybody, but there's private carriers that are doing freight delivery. There's also major government-backed USPS freight delivery service that are using our roads. They're doing major freight delivery along all of our borders. And I don't know how this is interacting with them. So I'm just curious about a little bit of detail about behind the scene on what you're looking at for freight and where your calculations are coming from for some of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we're really including everyone when you're looking at the data. It doesn't split it out. Like we don't know necessarily if it's an Amazon or if it's a Walmart. So they're all being included as far as the data goes, and a lot of that is we don't know exact counts for everything. It's very much an imperfect data set, but we extrapolate the information from what we do know, and then it just builds it out to make a reasonable justification of what that freight looks like. And so it doesn't separate it out, but it does cover all of those that you are talking about. And then on our freight steering committee, we've had some input from the private sector as well. And I'm trying to think who we had. We've had I'll have to check on the actual companies that we have specifically talked to, but generally we try to include like one or similar to, it's very difficult to get the private sector involved in a lot of these studies. It's just hard to get their participation. So unless we really break down and do like interviews specifically to companies that we're interested in, that's generally the best way to get their input. But we do a lot of these regional studies, and so we've really found ways to just kind of incorporate, I would say all of them more as an aggregate than individual companies. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. The reason I bring it up is because there's two things that happen, right? One is interstate freight transporting through Colorado along I-70 and I-25. But then there's also in the inside of the interstate part of the freight that we have to deal with locally. And I would think, specifically looking at the United States Postal Service, could probably glean a lot of information and knowledge from how they are doing that effectively within the state and the metro area. Only particularly because they are doing exactly what you're talking about already, and they've done it forever. And so being able to figure out how does a hotspot work to drop things off and then distribute from there, because that's exactly the work that they do, that they have done effectively. We might be able to get some information from them in partnership with how they're doing it. And we have the most important mail facility for the U.S. Postal Service right here in Denver. So you just gotta take a quick trip. I can go introduce you to the folks at Quebec and help you out with that if you need to. But really, like the type of information that you're looking for and the questions that you're asking here, I think that there's a potential partnership there to get data sets that might be unique within the freight industry from the largest freight provider in the state.
Definitely, I do want to reiterate, we do analysis on commodity inflows and outflows coming into the region and leaving, and identify what states, what specific locations within the state those are coming from as well. And then within the region, we do origin destination analysis to see how those commodities are flowing within the region too. So that's a really good starting point. And I think that your feedback is helpful to kind of take that next step to make sure that the freight plan, that we're using our data correctly, is exploring ways that as well.
All right, thank you very much. Any other questions? Thank you very much, Christina and Nicole. Thank you for the great presentations. All right, we'll move on to our last informational briefing, taking action on Regional Vision Zero update by our Catherine Rush, Senior Planner. And you have the floor.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. I think we're short on time, so I'm just going to touch on some of the key elements. I'm giving a status update on our kind of administrative minor update to taking action on Regional Vision Zero, which is the region's safety plan. It was adopted originally in 2020, and then had another update in 2024 where we adopted action items. But the current version uses 2013 to 2017 crash data to inform it. And so we were looking to update some of the key elements of the plan with more recent crash data. So the plan is used to help us prioritize and bring attention to corridors that may need additional funding or emphasis by local communities. It's used to guide our safety work. So the action items in there help inform the UPWP. It's used by local communities that may lack their own safety plans. So it helps to identify corridors with safety concerns as well as broader safety issues that are relevant across the region. And then it's also just generally used as a template and a resource for local communities that are developing their own plans. So this minor plan update was focused on updating the regional high injury network and the regional crash profiles. I'm going to get on what those mean in just a second. We hope to also adopt high risk networks so that we were being more proactive with identifying safety issues rather than waiting for serious crashes to occur. However, through the process of this, we found out that we don't have all of the data needed for that effort. So we're going to be focusing on writing more of a work plan for that. And then adding certain missing elements that have been flagged by USDOT as things to add, for example, the official safety goal for the region of 0 by 2040 is not actually in the plan, so just adding. So we have completed the Hydro Network draft and our regional crash profiles draft, and we are hoping to take it for public review later this summer. And so this is kind of this last update before that happens, and then adoption to this group as well as our other groups later this fall. So first, the proposed regional crash profile. These are the list of the factors and circumstances of a disproportionate number of serious and fatal injury fatal crashes in the region. These are the types of things that we want to address at more of a systemic level, at a system level, to really make a difference in addressing fatal and serious crashes. So that could be thinking about legislative changes. It could be thinking about a bigger system level package of improvements. It could be enforcement campaigns. These are, instead of just, spot locations or corridor locations, think bigger picture with these. So we have front to side crashes, basically with two vehicles impact in sort of this type of fashion. That could be left turn crashes, that could be broadside or T-bone type crashes. And really with this, we wanted to bring attention to left turn and red light running crashes. So for example, if we just addressed left turn at signalized intersections, we would take care of 7% of fatal and serious injury crashes in the region. So very specific type of crash in a very specific location. It's about the same percentage for red light running crashes. Collision with fixed objects. So this is where one vehicle is leaving the road and hitting an object. Now, there are many reasons this can happen, but one thing that's notable is that the majority of these crashes happen between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. when we have the few people on the road. So you can think about why those might be occurring as well. Motorcycle crashes, this is just seeing an ever increasing rise. If 18% of people killed or seriously injured, but 25% of vehicles in which somebody is killed or seriously injured are riding or in a motorcycle. 25% of vehicles. Pedestrian crashes account for 14% of people killed or seriously injured. Bicycle crashes, the lower percentage, but we know that it's a disproportionate share compared to the mode share, the number of people that ride bicycles. Speeding or too fast for conditions is the primary determinant of impact forces, which determines whether or not somebody is fatally wounded or seriously wounded in a crash. Alcohol suspected. We looked at different types of impairment, but alcohol still seems to be a key determinant. And then another thing that I think was flagged by this group, as well as by our regional vision zero working group, with emerging mobility devices. So you can think e-scooters, e-bikes, all those things that you see on the road where you're like, what is that? It doesn't currently make up a huge percentage of these crashes, but we're seeing just an ever increasing number, and it's something to bring attention to. We recognize that safety is unique throughout the region, and so bringing attention to different types of crashes that are different and more prevalent in certain areas. So in urban and suburban areas, it's crashes at signalized intersections and pedestrian crashes. In rural areas, it's these roadway departure crashes, particularly at curbs, that are significant. But front to side crashes are still significant in these areas, and then motorcycle crashes. And for limited access highways, that's where you really get a lot of rear end crashes, think people suddenly braking, and you just get these really high speed rear end crashes, and then not collision crashes, so just one vehicle possibly, making an evasive maneuver or something else and rolling over. So now we're going to move on to a discussion of the high injury network. So these are the roads that account for a disproportionate number of crashes. We wanted to bring attention to high injury corridors and its use for grant applications and other things. In general, this slide kind of summarizes what the differences are between this new high injury network and the current one. The key things to take away are that in terms of the scope, you're about to see the map of it, and you're gonna be like, that's a lot. In terms of the scope, it's actually pretty similar to the current hydro network, but we do capture actually a higher percentage of fatal and serious injury crashes. It's gonna look a little bit more fragmented, but the intent was to be more targeted, and especially with these rural areas that were primarily clustered around I-70 and didn't really have any emphasis on other hotspot locations. This helps bring attention to other areas, So as you can see, it's a lot of lines. We want it to be useful at a local level as well as the regional level, but with so many lines, it does become challenging about what to prioritize at regional level, which is why we also have critical corridors. So this is intended to be a second level of prioritization. It's intended to bring attention to corridors that are particularly high injury. And we have two options for critical corridors. Both of these options had equal support by our Regional Vision Zero working group, and both we heard a lot of support for both from TAC yesterday. Let me go into what each of those are. So the first option for critical corridors is what we're calling a regional approach. And it's actually, there's a little bit of typo here. It's the corridors that are in the top 10% for both these crashes of interest per mile and total crashes. So they have to have a high density of crashes, and they just have to capture a large raw number of crashes. So as you can see, it's very much clustered around our more populous, high traffic areas, but it does support kind of a regional approach to safety. Our second option is an equal county approach. So this identifies the top 10 routes in each county based off of crashes of interest per mile, so the density of crashes. To make sure that very short segments weren't kind of dominating this list, we set a minimum length threshold for these corridors. So in our urban and suburban counties, the corridors had to be at least a mile long, but in our more rural counties, they could be just a half mile long. So this could be more beneficial, this option, for sub-region, regional discussions, and more county level planning and prioritization and cross-jurisdictional collaboration at county level. So as I mentioned, we're going to be hoping to go out to public review later this summer and bring it back for adoption later this fall. I will take any questions.
Thank you, Catherine, very much for this time. I'll open up the floor for questions and comments. Director Condo, and then Commissioner.
Madam Chair, thank you for the presentation. Catherine. I'm curious, obviously you talked about alcohol related. I wonder if any of your analysis related to distracted driving, is there any work done on that?
Yes, that is a field in the crash report. However, it's known to be very underreported. It's very difficult to prove. But we certainly know that it's an issue. Just I think the fact that it's so hard to prove makes it challenging.
Commissioner Cook. Thank you. I think one of the corridors, the critical corridors under option one was Colorado. Is that true? And of course we had this big open house for potential BRT in that corridor. And they cited the fact that it's a high injury network corridor. Do you find in your research or your data that BRT implemented does reduce the crashes? Do we have that data?
So that might, Cole's smiling. I think Cole might even know that better than myself. I think I haven't seen any specific for BRT, but there's a lot of data about travel lane reduction, especially if it's a dedicated bus lane, because it just reduces the number of conflict points along a corridor, provides traffic calming benefits, things like that. Also, BRT tends to be accompanied by a lot of pedestrian improvements, which will therefore improve safety. So I think it's safe to say, yeah, because of those things, it would improve safety.
Yeah, and Commissioner Cook and everyone, just to add to that a little bit, and Catherine's right on. So we're at the beginning of our journey in this region of implementing arterial-based BRT, right? So Max will be the first one, and then the other corridors coming online. So I think we're going to learn a little bit the effects, but I will tell you the intention, big picture, when in this region, when we implement a major transportation investment like a BRT or a complete street or street reconstruction or whatever, I think the intent of all of our agencies is to really treat that as a generational investment. That's not just doing the thing, resurfacing or BRT or whatever it is, but really looking at that corridor in a comprehensive way. And yes, the hope and the intention is that absolutely when you have a generational investment in a corridor like a BRT, it's not just that transit project, it is also a safety project and a mobility project and an equity project and different types of boxes it is checking with that investment.
Any other questions or comments?
All right, thank you very much, Catherine. All right, this leads into our administrative items. The first up is Yeah, not sure who wants to think. I'll just turn it over to Larry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. CDOT's Transportation Commission is going to meet tomorrow. One of the big items for the commission is they'll be taking up the final adoption of CDOT's 10-year plan. That is the investment strategy for strategic projects statewide. There was a station to the DRCOG Board of Directors on projects specifically within the DRCOG region a few months back. I believe that was in January. I'm wrong on that. All right, I think I remember that meeting. But that'll be taken up by the Transportation Commission on Thursday. So otherwise, I think that kind of wraps up the statewide planning process, and all of those documents will be available online, and you're able to see those updated quarterly. So I think that's the major item that is up this month, and of course we're happy to collaborate all by to work on next month as well. So I'll turn it over to either Commissioner Cook or Commissioner Barrett.
I'll add a couple of things. I do want to highlight that BRT open house because it was probably the best attended open house we've had, or at least for years. One of the persons told me they stopped counting at 300 people. So it was really, and it wasn't, it was an interesting mix of people because it wasn't just people, all which you often see at a crowded open house. It was a mixture of people who really wanted it badly and people who were really concerned about it. So it'll be interesting to see how all that shakes out. Next is we have a workshop tomorrow that will provide us with an update on some wildfire mitigation measures that CDOT is undertaking in its mountain borders, especially, but also on the plains. They worked with the State Division of Fire Protection and Control to identify critical corridors where we want to get the fuels under control alongside the roads. And in DRCOG's region, Highway 72 up to the Peak Highway is the top priority. So they're going to be doing quite a bit of work there starting pretty quickly. And let's see, I wanted to note that some late moving legislation, 1430, among many other things, has created an enterprise, a road pavement enterprise at CDOT. It's not funded with new dollars, but the hope is, I think that they will have a dedicated fund. I think it's something Director Lewis worked for years. And secondly, we can aim to grow that over time. So that's all I have. Anything else?
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I will turn it over to RTD for update.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning, all. Deborah Johnson, General Manager and CEO of the Regional Transportation District. I want to touch on a couple of things that have some intersectionality. As you may be aware, on a triannual basis, RTD does its regular service changes, and the purpose of those service changes are to provide frontline employees with the opportunity to bid on different shifts, but also provide an opportunity to do schedule adjustments, make modifications, and in some instances, enhance service delivery. So with that as a backdrop, I mentioned this at our March meeting. The June 2026 service package was approved by the board and will go into effect on Sunday, June 7th. As a result of this effort, customers can expect some minor schedule adjustments across several bus routes and rail lines to maintain on-time performance. There are some additions of certain routes. You can go to our website, but more importantly, as we talk about the investment in infrastructure and primarily our state of good repair, our inaugural light rail line in downtown opened October 7th of 1994. And like with anything, like a 30-year-old house you're living in, you got to do things. You got to the plumbing, you got to replace the roof and things of the like. So as we learned, as we've gone forward with the first enhancement of the rail reconstruction project that took place back in 2024, it commenced Memorial Day weekend and was finished by Labor Day weekend. And we worked in partnership quite naturally with the city and county of Denver, as we don't own the infrastructure. We again are embarking upon some critical enhancements, and this will be tied into the service changes so we can mitigate impacts to our customers. And that was in the forefront when we made these decisions moving forward. Also, I would be remiss not to acknowledge our partnership with the state of Colorado, in particular with SB 230 and the Clean Transit Enterprise. RTD was the first out of the gate in reference to receiving $9.3
$3 million in funds that are generated by, oil and gas monies and so forth. And we do have some enhancements that are included in this round of service changes. Want to manage expectations. I'm looking at my dear director across from me. There is one enhancement that's made a lot of news. And want to manage expectations that $9.3 million is for the entire year. And as we go forward in reference to what we did with our application, there's other services that'll be included. And so working through our normal process, going to the board, doing our due diligence with transit equity and service analyses, those things will come forward in the near future. So I just wanted to clarify that because I know we've gotten a lot of questions as we move forward. But to speak more specifically about the downtown rail reconstruction, work will commence along the Colfax alignment near Bavaria and throughout the downtown loop. And quite naturally, as I indicated in my previous statement, there's close coordinations with the city and county of Denver. And what we're trying to ensure happens is that we maintain access, recognizing the downtown has been basically impacted with a lot of different construction, and we want to be good partners, but we also want to ensure, as we talk about generational improvements, that we have embedded rail that can last for another 30 years. So construction teams will take advantage of the coordinated scheduling windows and things of the like, and this work will continue into 2027. Additionally, speaking about partnerships, wanted to once again talk about the work that we've been doing with our state partners with the intercity passenger rail service after months of negotiation. And I'm looking at my dear friend over there, Diane Barrett, who worked with us at the outset when we came together and talked about this notion about we're better together, not only with, CDOT, but Colorado Transportation Innovations Office and Transit Enterprise, as well as representation from the executive branch. We were able to basically put forward a conceptual, term sheet that's enabling us and the board of directors authorized me in my capacity to go forward with a 90% conceptual engineering design that will bring us closer to providing some services along the Northwest Front Range. Additionally, I'll close out and then yield the floor because I know the directors have things to supplement. But on Friday, May 1st, marked the groundbreaking for the Colfax BRT in the city of Aurora. And that's very exciting as it's signifying the start of the end-to-end construction from Denver to Aurora. And so as we think about where we are, work is now advancing across all 5 segments of the corridor. And once completed, as we know, Colfax BRT is expected to reduce travel times up to 30 minutes along that major arterial, which is the longest contiguous business corridor in the in the United States. So with that, I will yield the floor to Director Guzman and then to Director Baker.
Thank you, Director Guzman, District C, which is north of West Denver. A little bit of downtown. For those of you that are light rail aficionados, please know that with the changes in June, if you regularly ride the D, the H, or the L lines, you will be impacted. Those will not be visible. We're suspending them while we do this work because they run through the downtown loop. But instead, you'll have a temporary T line that will help you get from Lincoln up to I-25 and Broadway. Down in Lone Tree, if you're coming from Highlands Ranch, you'll have the C, which I'm dubbing the construction line, from Littleton Mineral to Union Station to help you move around the region. And the R line will still be doing the connections from Florida all the way down to Bridgegate Parkway. So you should know that. If you want to find out more information, write this down, everybody. Take notes. rtd-denver.com/rail project, all one word. And it'll take you to all of the updated information. You can sign up for email reminders and updates that you'll get weekly. Our deputy CEO has taken charge of that project and outstanding job with it, and they are very timely, so that way you don't have to be frustrated that you don't know what's going on. You'll get it delivered to you. It's excellent. I do want to say Aurora Small Business Development Center is welcoming the businesses along the corridor for a chat on Thursday, 5/28.
from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. at Lama Chacha de Miyama, located at 11809 East Colfax Avenue in Aurora, Colorado. If you have questions about your team project and want to engage with other small businesses, that's a great opportunity. We're tracking the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill in Congress. It's apparently going to be known as Build America 250, and there's some interesting developments there. So it affects our work. Keep your eyes on it. Make opinions. Talk about it. Get to know what it says because it affects everything from transportation, transit-oriented development to freight to service. All of it. It's good stuff. Let's see, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was Golden to Morrison West Track Shuttle, which launches this June. Meaning if you are downtown, you get to downtown from any of the other areas of the metro, and you take the W line out to Golden, usually that's where you end it, you can't get any further. We're actually starting a project in partnership with Jefferson County to be able to get you from the Golden Center stop all the way up to Morrison or Red Rocks, Dinosaur Ridge, a few other places. And that will be throughout the summer. So check it out. If you want to go explore and don't want to drive along the 70 corridor to get out that far, guess what? We're giving you options. So take the train instead. We appreciate it. You know what? It's been a lot of fun working with you all. So I'm just going to share this with you because you have all inspired me in different ways. I have spent all of my time on the board with you, and I am accepted and going to attend another transportation to seek a Master of Science in Transportation Management. I found out that I was accepted, so I'm really excited about that. Located at San Jose State University in California, an awesome opportunity to go and become the expert that everybody clamors for here. So you will see me back. I'm not leaving. And that information will come back home with me and that knowledge and wisdom. So thank you all for your support and your passion around this because it's making cool things happen. And that includes everybody in the back over there hiding behind the chairs. I want to tell you thank you too.
Just a couple of things. First of all, congratulations, strategies. There are a lot of good things that are happening in our team. Quite a few. So it's a pretty exciting time, I think. To me, one of the most important projects that we passed last month was moving the preliminary engineering design work of the Northwest Rail Corridor. So our board appropriated $5.6 million forward with that, in conjunction with our partners, CDOT, CTIO, CTE, Front Range Passenger Rail, zones. So that particular project is moving forward. Hopefully at the end of the year, we'll be in a position to go forward and construct the railroad. Another important project that affects so many local governments is Colorado State Highway 7. This project has been worked on by many local governments for about 2 years. And what it would do is it would provide BRT type service from Boulder to Brighton. RTD has chimed in and said we're going to be a partner, and I believe it's going to start in September. It affects 3 different counties, probably about 6-7 different cities. Going again from Boulder to Brighton. It's something that those communities have been working on forever. It's finally going to happen. The last thing that we have to be thankful for, at least for my district, Longmont, Lafayette, Louisville, Erie, looks like we're going to be getting Skyride to DIA. That hopefully is going to start later this year. So there's a lot of excitement. I will tell you in Longmont, I was surprised at how many people have inquired about all the details. So hopefully this is going to get kicked off real soon. I do have a request. I don't know if it's possible, but here's more requests perhaps for the next meeting. If Initiative 175 gets sufficient signatures, could we perhaps have an overview some sort of information with regard to how that would affect transportation funding here in DRCOG region. And also then my understanding then is House Bill, I believe it's 1430 would kick in and have. So I think that would be very helpful information. It's transportation types. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to RAC.
Very good, thanks, and I'll be quick here. Just for everyone's attention, that the summertime ozone season is kicking off. We had a few excursions of seasons of the ozone standard in the first part of May. And so we are just going to kick off our education outreach program for the summer months, and appreciate everyone's partnership in helping us disseminate our information on how individuals, companies, corporations can reduce their impact on emissions and improve air quality for all of us throughout the year. So you'll be hearing lots of announcements and information in the next few months. So appreciate everybody's support and participation in our efforts to improve air quality. And I just wanted to give a little shout out to Darius sitting down the line. We've received at RAC finally a notice to proceed for some funding from the non-attainment area pollution mitigation enterprise that Darius helps manage. And there was some issues in kicking off the funding cycle as far as issuing notices to proceed, working with contracts and all, and with Darius's management and perseverance and my nagging. I'm sorry, but we finally have received that notice to proceed. So it's excellent resources for RAC to do its work and to expand our work into other parts of the non-attainment area that we didn't touch before, and with our programs and our outreach. So just appreciate Darius and Scott's coordination and support for RAC.
Congratulations. I'm going to turn it over to Jacob for the next time. He's going to talk about a little bit of an updated building architecture.
Going to be much less than a minute given what time it is. I don't want to keep us, but thank you, Director Guzman, for mentioning it. I just wanted to give a brief update that yes, in the House, through the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, they've introduced a bipartisan bill. It's only 1,005 pages long. The Build America 250 Act, it came out on Sunday, so we are starting to review it. I don't actually want to get much in what's in the bill right now, because I think the point I want to make in the time left here is that while this is a bipartisan bill coming out of House T&I, it's going to get through the House, and it's undetermined what's going to happen in the Senate. The Senate is far behind the House on this kind of work, in the Senate, when they do get to it, will probably modify it significantly. And that's if this all happens before September 30th, and particularly before the November elections. If it doesn't, then given the new composition of the House and Senate after elections, they'll frankly probably have to start over next year if they don't get it done before elections. So rather than getting too much into the bill right now, though we are reviewing it, just want to put in context that what you're seeing is likely to change before it becomes final. So thank you, Chair.
Madam Chair, if I can, and mark up this tomorrow with House T&I, that when we think about what's going to happen, it's going to be so many different iterations. I just wanted to amplify that, considering things are moving so quickly, and we're monitoring this over the weekend, and that should be interesting. All right, thank you so much for indulging me.
Thank you. Any other?
Did anybody have any other comments or questions for us today?
I do have one. Sorry, I don't know why I didn't think about this earlier, but if you're in the RTD district, figure out who your candidates are and cast what may be your final vote for elected directors. Our legislature made decisions, and the governor will sign it into law and serve, I'm sure. But this body, this group, DRCOG, and the people that are here are going to be making recommendations, and we need to know who is making decisions on behalf of the people that you serve from the RTD. Because I can guarantee you that if you are not aware and you are not having these conversations in your community, you're going to end up with people that you don't want doing it. They're either going to be heartless, or they're going to be factual or money based, and it's not going to make a damn bit of difference, sorry, about what you tell them, because they're no longer going to be elected, they're going to be appointed, and you will not have control over it. So for at least 2 more years, make the point to get to know who those candidates are, engage in conversation, put them to the test, ask them questions and get their knowledge base, or find somebody else to represent you, get them in that race real quick, because they still now have to collect, signatures to run. There's no write-in option. The only other option will be for the county commissioners or the mayor of the large city that they're in to appoint until that changes. So kiss that goodbye, but make sure you do your due diligence as citizens, and let's all hope we get good candidates. Thanks.
Director Davis.
Thank you. Just quickly, I wanted to thank RTE. We are very excited in Arvada for the G line going from every 30 minutes to every 15 minutes. I cannot tell you how many people I hear from that are ecstatic about this change. So thank you so very much. Our person in Harvard.
Right. Executive Director Rex has your parking passes to get out of jail downstairs. I want to say thank you very much for being here today and for all the work that you guys do. It's really just, thank you very much. We will see you all on July 7th, and take care and stay safe.